Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is John Peavyhouse. I'm a professor of public policy at the Follette School and also chair of the political science department. Welcome to this afternoon's second keynote panel on power, the rise of China, and the future of American foreign policy. The rise of China as a global power over the past 3 decades is one of the most pressing global challenges today, with direct consequences for the future of American power and prosperity, as well as questions on global governance ranging from trade to climate to the environment more broadly. We've clearly moved beyond a unipolar moment in world history, where many believed the U.S. stood alone in the world as the only global superpower. Today, China's economy arguably rivals that of the United States in some measures, and some believe China will soon surpass the United States in terms of global hegemonic power. Others see a new era of great power competition, with China, the United States, a revisionist Russia, and the European Union competing for great power status. Some argue, in fact, that the United States is already a power in decline, or that American hegemony is on the wane. Others contend that, like the death of Mark Twain, the end of American hegemony is greatly exaggerated. Our panel this afternoon will focus on some key questions dealing with these shifting power dynamics. And let me just lay out some of the questions that the panelists were given to think about as they prepared their remarks. Is America in decline as the world's leading power? What does this imply for peace and prosperity in the years ahead? To what extent does China pose a serious security or economic threat to the U.S.? How effective has the Biden administration's foreign policies been, both in general and specifically with regard to China? In retrospect, was admitting China to the World Trade Organization a mistake? What could we have done differently to incorporate China in the global economy? Are we headed for a new Cold War? What lenses and frameworks would be most useful to understand U.S.-China relations? And should the U.S. deepen our formal military and economic ties with Asian-Pacific partners like Australia, Japan, Korea, India, and Taiwan? To help us wrestle with these questions, we have a phenomenal panel of experts. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers, Paul Blustein, Oriana Skylar Mastro, along with our discussants, Professors Tana Johnson and Jessica Weeks. Let me first introduce Paul Blustein. Paul's an award-winning journalist and author who has written about economic issues for more than 40 years. He's a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance and Innovation, a think tank in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. Prior to joining CIGI in 2010, he was a journalist in residence at the Brookings Institution. Paul spent 2 decades as a staff writer for the Washington Post and a decade as a staff reporter and chief economic correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Paul's work has won several prizes, including the Gerald Loeb Award for business journalism's most prestigious honor. In addition to his media publications, Paul has written 6 books that are essential reading for understanding the politics of the world economy. His book, Laid Low on the European Financial Crisis in the 2010s, is perhaps the single best book on the subject, something Professor Koplovich and I agree on. And his books on the role of the International Monetary Fund and financial crises of the 1990s and 2000s, both The Chastening and The Money Kept Rolling In, are essential reading for anyone interested in the politics of the global economy and the rise of globalization in the 90s and 2000. His latest book, Schism, China, America, and Fracturing the Global Trading System, was published in September of 2019. Perhaps most importantly, however, Paul is a proud Badger, receiving his BA in history from the UW-Madison in 1973 before heading to Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship, where he was graduated with an MA in philosophy, politics, and economics, and it's our great pleasure to welcome him back to Madison. Thank you, Paul. Oriana Skylar Mastro is a center fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute of International Studies at Stanford University, where her research focuses on Chinese military security policy, Asia-Pacific interests, war termination, nuclear dynamics, and coercive diplomacy. She's a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and also serves in the U.S. Air Force Reserve, where she works as a strategic planner for IndoPacific. For her contributions for U.S. strategy in Asia, she won the Individual Reservist of the Year Award in 2016. She has won a number of prestigious awards, including the 2016-2017 Stanton Nuclear National Security Fellowship at the Council of Foreign Relations. She's published widely, including in Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, International Security, the Washington Quarterly, and Survival. Her book, The Costs of Conversations, Obstacles to Peace Talks in Wartime, won the 2020 American Political Science Association International Security Section Best Book Award by an untenured faculty member. She holds a BA in East Asian Studies from Stanford and an MA and a PhD in Politics from Princeton. In addition to the keynote speakers, I'm happy to share the podium with 2 of my colleagues at the University of Wisconsin. Tana Johnson is an associate professor in public affairs and political science at UW-Madison. Her work focuses on the operation and design of international institutions and international organizations, specifically those affiliated with the UN system. She's the author of numerous articles in top academic journals, as well as the book Organizational Progeny, Why Governments Are Losing Control Over the Proliferating Structures of Global Governance, which won the International Studies Association's Alger Award for Best Book on International Organizations. She's received a research fellowship from the Niehaus Center of Globalization at Princeton and from the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions at Vanderbilt. She's also been an energy policy fellow through the Global Governance Futures Program, which brings together practitioners and academics from the US, Japan, India, Germany, China, and Brazil. Prior to joining us on the faculty here at UW, she was an associate professor of public policy and political science at Duke. Tana is also a Badger alum from my own political science department and holds a PhD from the University of Chicago. Finally, Jessica Weeks, my colleague in political science, is a professor and H. Douglas Weaver Chair of Diplomacy and International Relations in the Department of Political Science. Her research and teaching interests focus on the links between domestic politics and foreign policy, the domestic and international politics of authoritarian regimes, and how public opinion affects foreign policy. She's published widely in top journals. She's the author of Dictator at War and Peace, from Cornell Press, which was selected by Foreign Affairs as one of the best books in international relations in 2014. She's also the 2018 recipient of the International Studies Association's Karl Deutsch Award, recognizing the scholar under 40 who has made the most significant contributions to the study of international relations. Jessica received her BA in political science from The Ohio State University in 2001, a master's degree in international history from the Graduate Institute in Geneva, and a PhD from Stanford in 2009. Prior to being in Madison, she was an assistant professor of government at Cornell University. So each of our speakers will speak for 20 minutes. Our two, Paul and Oriana will speak for 25 minutes, followed from 5-ish minutes from our two discussants. And then we'll open it up for a broader Q&A. Paul will be speaking mostly about economic issues relating to China, given his work and past writing, whereas Oriana will focus more on the security issues, although at the end, we will throw it open to an intellectual melee of any questions and all comments. So please join me in welcoming Paul Blustein.
Thanks very much for such a kind introduction. I appreciate you mentioning my books. You know, I just want to point out that Mother's Day is just around the corner. So it's been great to be back in Madison and stroll, you know, State Street and Library Mall and Mifflin Street, all these places that bring back memories. Whoops, okay, that's my title slide. All these places that bring back memories for me as a student here in the late 60s and early 70s, very turbulent times when we in the student body engaged in impassioned debates about whether direct action against capitalist targets was justified or whether the petty bourgeoisie would be alienated from the revolutionary cause if small businesses on State Street were trashed. You know, this sort of high intellectual discussion. And there was a girl who I knew back then in the student body. She was in the class ahead of me, and we weren't particularly friendly. We disagreed on some of these burning issues of the day, but that's neither here nor there. The point I want to make is that she was a tough cookie. She was a formidable intellect. Her name was Charlene Barshevsky, and I encountered her again a couple of decades after we graduated from the University of Wisconsin when I was covering economic issues for the Washington Post, and she was the US trade representative under President Bill Clinton. And I gained new appreciation for what a tough cookie Charlene is. And never was that more manifest than in November of 1999 when she negotiated the agreement with the Chinese government that paved the way for China's entry into the World Trade Organization. This was a historic achievement, probably certainly the most, I would say, important of her many achievements as U.S. trade representative, because here you had this, you know, the world's most populous country, still shedding the vestiges of Maoist totalitarianism, and it was integrating into the global economy. Now, there's a wide there's a wide body of opinion that this deal was sort of the original sin in U.S.-China relations, that the U.S. was enabling China to get rich and powerful at American expense, and that the U.S. government got bamboozled, and that Charlene Barshevsky in particular got bamboozled, and that China has cheated. And one of the better known exponents of this particular view is the former President of the United States, who called it a disastrous, terrible agreement. You also see on the slide here a snippet from an article by Nikki Haley, the former ambassador to the United Nations. And the sentence I've underlined from that article is, the United States helped China enter the World Trade Organization on lenient terms. So this is sort of what you might call, to paraphrase Tucker Carlson, the masculinity crisis of theory of U.S.-China relations. That, we've been wimps and we've let them roll all over us. A much more nuanced view I've come across is in this book by Rush Doshi. It was published about 3 years ago. Doshi is now the top China guy in the National Security Council in the Biden administration. So it's not just the chest thumping on the right who critique this deal. Doshi's view is that this deal enabled China to blunt U.S. power, and that this was part of its long game to displace the American order. And in his view, China had this paramount goal in these negotiations to blunt American power by getting permanent most favored nation status, permanent normal trading relations, as it's also called, which meant that there would be an end to the votes that took place in Congress at that time every year, where Congress would vote based on China's human rights record, on whether Chinese goods would be allowed into the U.S. market on the same terms as other countries. And he argues that China regarded this as an exercise of U.S. leverage over China, and that they were just desperate to get rid of it, and that they were willing to make compromises, big sacrifices by opening up their markets to American companies, and because they had to achieve this blunting of American power as part of their long game. Well, I have also written a book about China's entry into the WTO and what ensued from that, and I regard both the masculinity crisis view and Doshi's more nuanced as factually incorrect. I'll be talking a little about what happened back then, but I want to make some broader points, which is that a U.S.-China schism materialized, the U.S.-China schism that has materialized. I think we all know that there's a schism in economics and other subjects, but I'm going to be talking about economics, that has inflicted very severe damage on the international trading system, that both the U.S. and China are very heavily to blame for what has happened, and that the world is going to be poorer, or at least less rich than it otherwise would be as a result. And the risks are very high that schism is going to get worse, and that the consequences will be even more adverse. Now, to explain why I'm concerned about the world getting poorer, I want to talk a little about the World Trade Organization, which is far from a perfect institution, far from it. It's got many flaws. But look, this is the current embodiment of the system that was set up after World War II, that's aimed at preventing a return to the horrors of the 30s, the protectionism and the hostile trade blocs that exacerbated the Great Depression and eventually led to World War II, right? So, and under WTO rules, countries, the 164 member countries, agree they've reached under negotiated deals that have taken place over decades. They promise that they will keep limits on their barriers to imports from abroad. And if they don't like what some other country is doing, if they think that one of their trading partners is playing unfair or not living up to the terms of the agreements and are cheating in one way or another, they're supposed to go to impartial international tribunals to decide who's right and who's wrong, as opposed to just slapping tariffs on each other and getting into tit-for-tat trade wars. And that keeps global commerce from operating, by the law of the jungle or might makes right or whatever you want to call it. And that results, in turn, in stability and predictability in international commerce, which helps the global economy grow. Because when you don't have that kind of predictability, and businesses fear that governments will just raise or lower the barriers to movement of goods and services across borders, based on sort of capricious decisions, then they're going to be more reluctant to invest and build the kinds of enterprises and operations that create jobs and raise living standards. Now, to get into this organization and get the rights and protections that it offers to member countries, China had to adopt a really sweeping, extensive range of market opening measures and reforms of its system. And I want to just emphasize these did not include human rights and democracy. This was a hope that the Clinton administration had and expressed quite fervently, but that was not part of the deal. China didn't promise to do anything. This was a trade agreement, right? But the point I want to make is that it's absurd to call the terms that were negotiated lenient, to use Nikki Haley's word. China, if you talk to the negotiators on the Chinese side, as I have, who were involved in some of these negotiations, they get quite emotional. They're still resentful about the way they feel China was treated, that they were accorded second-class citizenship, because these were the terms that very tough cookie, Charlene Barshevsky, insisted on. Trade wonks called, now one example of this is what trade wonks call WTO plus obligations and WTO minus rights. In other words, they had to accept more odious duties that they had to fulfill to get in than other countries, and they got fewer of the rights and privileges in other countries. And I want to mention one episode that I came across in my research. About I think it's quite revealing. It concerns a meeting of the Chinese Politburo. Right on the eve of those crucial negotiations in Beijing that I showed the picture of. And this account is provided by we don't know the exact name of it. It's a top-ranking Chinese official who gave an account of this Politburo meeting. Of course, Politburo meetings are not like, there's no congressional record, right? They're supposed to be secret. But his account was published in 2002. And he wrote about how Zhu Rongji, who was the premier of China at that time, and was really the mastermind, really the main driving force in the Chinese government behind the entry into the WTO, that he was facing tremendous opposition in the Chinese leadership and others in the Politburo to striking this deal. They thought that the American side is asking way too much of us. Let's just not go for this. And one of the points he made, he said, we must cast away illusions. Now, this is basically, kind of transcript that apparently does exist in the Chinese records, it's just not public. We must cast away illusions that the U.S. will make concessions if we adopt a tough stance. And I think this really belies the sort of the Nikki Haley view that Barshevsky and the others in the U.S. were just rolling over for China. Zhu Rongji was saying, look, we are dealing with a very tough cookie here, right? I mean, this is to put it in colloquial English. And then he went on to say, opening up to the outside is a fundamental state policy, and practice has proven that the earlier we open up, the more rapid will be our development. And this shows, this was Zhu Rongji's prime goal, was to use these negotiations as a way of forcing opening in the Chinese market and the Chinese economy, because he thought that would make the Chinese economy more dynamic. And I think this belies the Doshi view that that this was about blunting American power. I mean, of course, the Chinese did not like the fact that Congress held a vote every year on their human rights. They didn't like it one bit, but they knew. I think they knew that they were going to get, they were going to get that sort of thing was going to end anyway as part of these negotiations. The prime goal was the one that Zhu Rongji states there. And he was right, because the Chinese economy, after it got into the WTO, it had already been growing at a very rapid pace in the late 80s and early 90s and throughout the 90s, but its growth trajectory went up steeply thereafter. Now, this had some downsides for the United States, because the Chinese export juggernaut led to an increase in the amount of unemployment in the Rust Belt and in the industrial sectors of the United States. Now, it's important to keep this in perspective. Manufacturing employment in all industrial countries had been declining for decades before this for reasons having to do with productivity and technology. Some of this was discussed in this morning's session, I know. But it is true that in the years immediately following China's entry into the WTO, the manufacturing employment, the decline accelerated, and I don't think that's a coincidence. And it was tragic for the people who were affected, because government in this country at all levels did a very poor job of providing any kind of assistance and creating the environments on which people could adjust properly to the changed economic circumstances. But on the other hand, to everyone's benefit, China's and the American economy as well, China became a more dynamic economy. Thousands of its laws and regulations were either changed or scrapped to especially those concerning discrimination against foreign competition. And this was to conform with the promises that the Chinese government had made. Now, having said all that, things did not turn out as Charlene Barshevsky had envisioned, and she would be the first to admit that, and she has admitted it publicly on many occasions. She's complained about it quite vociferously. China took a U-turn from the path that Zhu Rongji had wanted China to go on. It certainly wasn't abrupt. It took place over quite a number of years. It was gradual, but it was unmistakable and consequential. And it was a move away from that opening up and that more free enterprise approach toward what's called, it goes by various names, China Inc., state capitalism, techno-nationalism, whatever you like. And this process accelerated after the global financial crisis in 2008, when the Chinese became sort of understandably disillusioned with the American model. And it accelerated even faster when Xi Jinping became the supreme leader in 2012, 2013. And so I've listed some of the main mileposts along the way. They're over on the left side of the slide: the establishment of some very powerful government institutions and beefing up of those institutions that gave the Chinese party state more control over the commanding heights of the economy and the internal workings of the Chinese market. There was an initiative called Indigenous Innovation, launched in 2006, that gave some of China's national champions a leg up at the expense of foreign competitors. Xi Jinping really ramped that whole approach up with his Made in China 2025 initiative that he launched in 2015. There's been a retreat from rule of law in China under Xi Jinping. The Communist Party has a much greater reach into businesses of all kinds, not just the state-owned ones, but even big private businesses, and even some foreign businesses. And of course, there's controls over the flow of information and cyberspace in China that's far in excess of anything in Western countries. And this was a violation of at least the spirit of the WTO, if not necessarily the rules. By the spirit of the WTO, I'm sort of borrowing from the preamble to the declaration that was signed in Marrakesh, Morocco in 1994. This was the formal establishment of the WTO, and that preamble contains the words that they envision the world trading system based on open market-oriented policies, which was not where China was going. And now, of course, other countries, and certainly not the no one laid down and just accepted what China was doing. They hauled China in front of WTO tribunals on numerous occasions to accuse them of failing to live up to their commitments or violating the rules. And it must be said, when China lost those cases, when tribunals found them in violation of the rules, China was commendably compliant. And you might argue that the U.S. has been much more of a scofflaw. There have been several major cases where the U.S. has just kind of, pretended to abide by WTO rulings. China, I would say, has been more law-abiding in that regard. But the problem is that China's practices are not always covered by the WTO rules, and crucially, one of the main reasons for this is the lack of transparency in the Chinese system. Nobody can tell for sure when the party state is sort of directing resources or subsidies to its own national champions at the expense of foreign competitors. So, the way this might work, for example, is a Chinese bank manager might give a loan on very favorable terms to a Chinese company, not because there's some directive from the government to do that, because that would be a transparent violation of the rules. If it was a direct government subsidy, it would be actionable at the WTO. But instead, it's more the bank officials looks at the state plan, which says such and such a sector we view this as strategically important, and that bank officer knows that if he or she makes this loan that their career is going to be advanced. So, this is a non-transparent way of working. And this, we're not talking about Ethiopia Inc. We're not talking about Vietnam Inc. This is China Inc. This is a really big economy. It's the second largest as measured by GDP and the largest trading country. So China became the world's biggest the trading system's biggest problem until 2018. When the U.S. decided it was going to give China a run for its money as the biggest problem in the world trading system. This was when the Trump administration launched its trade war by just basically, announcing by presidential decree tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars in Chinese products on no real authority other than the say-so of Trump and his trade representative. Of course, they had legal justifications that they trotted out for it, but it was a blatant violation of WTO rules. It was launching that kind of trade war that you're not supposed to do under the rules of the system. And of course, the Chinese retaliated, and we were off to a tit-for-tat trade war. In addition to that, the Trump administration took a very aggressive approach to dealing with Chinese technology. Exhibit A here is Huawei, the telecommunications firm. Previous administrations had banned Huawei from bringing its products into the U.S. market for fear that they could be used to enhance Chinese espionage, right, which was an understandable national security based decision. But the Trump administration basically decided, well, we're going to put this company out of business as best we can, and they imposed controls on the export of the kinds of U.S. high-tech components and software that Huawei needs to build its stuff. So this was the Chinese took this. If you take their perspective on it, you can sort of see why their attitude was, well, the U.S. is determined to block our economic rise, and so Xi Jinping doubled down on his efforts to try to make the Chinese tech sector more self-sufficient. And in addition to all that, the Trump administration crippled the WTO's dispute settlement system, that system of tribunals that I mentioned earlier, by refusing to allow a consensus among member countries to appoint new members of the appellate body, this is sort of the Supreme Court of the WTO. So this was just eviscerating that whole system of adjudicating disputes. And this flouting of the rules and the evisceration of the dispute settlement system has sent the global trading system much more in a direction of law of the jungle. And there's no econometric model that can tell you how much the adverse consequences will flow from that in terms of gross domestic product. The lessening of stability and predictability in global it's a very intangible thing, but I think it stands to reason that the world is going to be poorer than, or at least less rich than it would be otherwise, and this will be a long-term problem. Now, the Biden administration came in, and they have, completely diverged from Trump's policy in a whole range of areas, but not in this one. I think that the Biden administration's trade policy, and in particularly its trade policy toward China, has justifiably been called Trump light or polite protectionism. Of course, Biden, there's none of the bluster, there's none of the stupid bombast or the tweeting in the middle of the night about complaining about the trade policies of Canada and this other stuff that we had under Trump. And Biden works much more cooperatively with allied countries, which is tremendously important and commendable. But the Trump tariffs do remain in effect, on the tariffs on China, along with demands for China to fulfill the terms of the agreement. It's called the Phase 1 agreement, which did nothing to change China's trade practices. It was just a promise by the Chinese to buy more American stuff than they were buying before. And there's been no movement by the Biden administration on this. I think on this very important issue of reviving the WTO dispute settlement system. What should the Biden administration have done? Well, I thought there was a brilliant proposal by Jennifer Hillman, who's a former Clinton administration trade official and former member of the WTO appellate body. She proposed that the U.S. confront China very aggressively in the WTO by bringing a case together with a whole, with dozens of other countries that don't like the way China's trading system has evolved, and to accuse the Chinese of violating the spirit of the whole institution. And there's a provision of WTO rules called the nullification and impairment provision, which basically says even if a country can't be found, you can't prove that they're guilty of one particular rule if what their actions are nullifying or impairing the benefits you expect to receive, legitimately expect to receive under the trading system, then you can bring a case. Now, do I think this would have been, the U.S. would have brought this case and some tribunal would have banged the gavel and said, yes, the U.S. wins. No, that's not the way that's not what would have happened. But WTO litigation there's supposed to be negotiations among the conflicting parties. And I think that, we'll never know, but the Chinese might very well have been more forthcoming about ending some of their most objectionable trade practices in that type of forum, where it's the international community, and they're in front of an impartial tribunal, as opposed to being bullied by Donald Trump. So, but anyway, that proposal did not, the Biden administration didn't pick up on that. They've gone in the direction of Trump light. I think this is partly politics, of course. They don't want to be accused of being soft on China. But it's also ideological. I mean, if you accept Rush Joshi's view that China is engaged in a long game to displace the American order, look, there's a lot to admire about this book. I learned a lot from it. I found his central argument not terribly convincing, in particular on economics. But anyway, the point is that explains I think that helps explain where the Biden administration has gone on all this. And so now, to bring us up to date, we've got the sanctions on Russia. This morning's speaker, Adam Posen, has an article in Foreign Affairs and he touched on some of the themes on that in his comments. This is a brilliant article. I highly commend it to you, where he argues, look, the sanctions are necessary and warranted, but there's going to be a lot of negative ramifications for economic globalization. And, Americans have learned, and this was also touched on in this morning's session, wow, for all the talk of decline in our power, wait a minute, we have this weapon. I mean, I think the American public and probably many members of Congress didn't know that just quite how powerful we are because of the dominance of the dollar in international commerce. We can cut individuals, we can cut companies, we can cut whole countries off from access to the dollar in the U.S. and the dollar-based system. And this chart over on the left shows, Menzie Chin had some other more detailed charts this morning showing that the extent to which the dollar is way above other currencies in international. That's the basis for the power. What concerns me is I think that pressure to do the same to China is going to intensify. Whether and who knows why that'll happen. Of course, obviously, an invasion of Taiwan there would be a demand for it. But you can imagine scenarios even if if there's another crackdown in Hong Kong or in Xinjiang or wherever. I mean, there's a lot of people in Washington who are kind of itching for a fight. And could we cut China off from the dollar-based system as we've done with Russia? Yes, we could. But the collateral damage, as bad as it's been seems like it's going to be with Russia, as necessary as it is, the damage is going to be extensive. But with China, it would be, I think, immensely greater. It's not just that the Chinese economy is 10 times the size of Russia. It's because of the interdependence of China's economy with everyone else in the global economy. A lot of global supply chains just will not function efficiently the way they're constructed now without Chinese facilities. And we saw this a lot, in the whole talk about when decoupling became sort of a big term in the mass media during the Trump administration. There was a lot of talk about companies moving to Vietnam and Bangladesh and India and so forth. But if you talk to people who had operations in China, they would tell you that no, there is no substitute for this. The physical and human infrastructure in China, the rail lines, the engineers, the logistics, the networks of vendors, you just can't replace it. And so the point is, China can say, look, if you're going to hurt our economy, we're going to hurt you right back. And I think it would be mutual assured destruction. Now, Would the Biden administration take such a step in a cavalier fashion? No, but I can think of some possible future presidents of the United States who might. Just to conclude, we've had a really bad couple of decades in the trading system, as Adam mentioned this morning. And this is thanks in large part to this schism between the U.S. and China. By this, I mean, I'm referring to the definition of discord and disharmony. We've got toxic mutual distrust and so forth. So we certainly have a schism. The question is, will we get a full-fledged schism in the sense of a real, all-out economic war? I don't know. But I feel very confident in saying that my fellow University of Wisconsin student should not be held to blame for that.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me today to talk about China's power. As was previously mentioned, I'm a China military and security specialist, so I will be showing some slides on the dire. If you think the econ situation is dire, I will tell you that as someone who's been planning for in order to deter conflict in Asia, now wars for 12 years, it has gotten harder and harder to come up with scenarios to ensure that the United States can maintain peace and stability in this area. Today, what I want to do, however, is talk about how China competes more broadly. One of my main critiques of scholarship right now in China, I think, is we focus too much on the what, kind of like, what does China want? What are they trying to achieve? And a lot of assumptions that China wants to be exactly like the United States. The book that Paul mentioned, Rush Doshi's book, who is a former student of mine, actually, at Princeton, it falls in line with this kind of thinking of, well, we did it, how we do things is awesome, so China is probably going to want to do things exactly like us. What I'm hoping to convince you today is that China's rise has been somewhat unusual in a number of ways, and that as we sit here and pat ourselves on the back about how we're doing everything right, we have to admit that in all aspects of power, China has been able to make some really impressive gains. And one of the things I think most people do not realize is how much has significantly changed in the past 20 years. When I first started taking Chinese as an undergraduate at Stanford, there were 7 people in my intro to Chinese class. We still all know each other because we did the whole 4 years together. Everyone else was still, taking Japanese. There was an article in 2002, the National Security Strategy of the United States came out talking about how the United States could not allow for the rise of a near-peer competitor. And the scholarly community in various publications in foreign affairs, what have you, basically determined that the closest thing to a near-peer competitor that would come to fruition in the following 20 years would be Europe. And they all dismissed China as a possibility. And there are many reasons for this, because if you look at China 20 years ago, it looks very different from China today. Economically, China's economy was smaller than France's. And just think about that for a minute, right? If we wave our fingers and we're like, oh, those trade representatives, everyone should have known, and this, that, and the other. The Chinese had a very small economy, and every step of the reforms, people said when China was like, I'm going to do this differently, they said, well, it's not going to work. You have to have a free system or contracts, no one's going to trust a contract. You have to, once foreign banks come into the Chinese system, their banking system's going to collapse. There was just doubt after doubt after doubt that if China didn't follow the path of the United States, they wouldn't succeed. And yet, here they were in 2019 reaching 16% of GDP, and by some measures, if you look at purchasing power parity, for example, they've already surpassed the United States, and otherwise people predict that they will surpass the United States in terms of the size of the economy. Military spending. This is one of my favorite charts because I've been writing extensively about how all autocracies are not created equal. So just because Russia's military sucks tells us nothing about China's military. All the problems that Russia is facing, China does not have. And this chart just gives you just one data point to help you understand this. Since 1992, Chinese spending on its military has increased by 740%. Russia's 60%. Even so, the Russian budget has been less than that of China's. And there's a lot of debate about Chinese budget, so this is a compilation of some more authoritative sources because they don't declare everything. But we know that their spending has increased. One thing that I really like to point out from this chart, Chinese spending is still a lot less than that of the United States, right? But from a weaker resource position, whether it's economics, military, political, they have been able to compete with us. This is what force posture in the Indo-Pacific looked like in 1999. Right, when I first edited one of my first volumes in 2005 on the cross-strait balance over Taiwan. At that point, the Chinese invasion plan was to commandeer some fishing boats and paddle their way over. We were not worried. This is what it looks like today. The United States we have one base in the vicinity of Taiwan. The Chinese have 39. We have no way of protecting it. China has the most advanced cruise and ballistic missile programs in the world. They're the only country in the world that can hit a moving ship at sea with anti-ship ballistic missiles. And anyone who tells you that China looks at the U.S. military and says that they are fearful of fighting the United States, not only are not looking at the balance of forces that we see on this map, but they're not paying attention to a lot of the vulnerabilities that the United States has that China does not have, like reliance on space for navigation, communication. China's fighting, doesn't mean the Chinese military is better, but they are fighting with a home court advantage, right? It's kind of like I don't have a landline, but I'm sure some of us here still have landline telephones, that if you if your cell phone started working, you could still pick up the phone and call someone. The United States, we don't have those abilities, while in China, they could still use land communications and things like that. So this picture tells you that even though they had a lot less money, a lot less focus, they are able to compete with the United States and do it in a way that causes problems and challenges. And it's not just economic or military, political power and diplomatic power. China, in the 1990s, just started joining international institutions. When we first started looking at this, China didn't even have normal diplomatic relations with some key countries in the international system, like South Korea. So no one was sitting around wondering, does China have more political influence in the world than the United States? But they joined all these international organizations and then started to become very involved in ways that would benefit them. And there's an index over at Lowy that tries to measure the connectivity between countries, and they've come to the conclusion that China, in terms of a comprehensive power index, when you look at economic capability, relationships, defense, cultural influence across the board, that China is only number 2 to the United States. And when it comes to foreign policy power, they have surpassed the United States in diplomatic influence and in their networks and multilateral power. So I paint that picture just to show you how much China has done from a weaker position. So as a side note, when people ask me, what if if the Chinese economy slows down, then we'll have nothing to worry about. Even if the Chinese economy is completely stagnant, they will have more resources the next 25 years than they've had the past 25 years. And a lot of this has to do with strategic choices that are being made. And the argument that I'm making in a book I'm currently writing is that one of the reasons that we sort of missed this picture, and one of the reasons I think that political scientists haven't quite captured China's strategy, is there's a large assumption of emulation. That to become a great power, you emulate great power successes. So we have always assumed that China is going to do things the way that the United States does things. It makes sense. It worked for the United States. Why wouldn't it work for China? What I argue in my book is there's a lot of reasons why that is not a good strategy to do what the established power does. First and foremost, it might not work for you. China is a fundamentally different country than the United States. And so in my readings of Chinese strategic thinking, in a lot of cases, they admit, yeah, this has been a great way forward for the United States, but this would never work for us. And, I think about this constantly. When I teach, I give a lot of personal anecdotes to help my students understand. And it constantly reminds me of senior colleagues in my field trying to describe to me how I should structure my career. And how none of them had any considerations of pregnancy, right? Like, I remember having a fight with Georgetown because I wanted to take my junior research leave early to do my field work for my book. And they were like, well, everyone else does it, in their 4th and 5th year. And I was like, well, everyone else doesn't have to be pregnant for 18 to, depending on how many kids I have, I can't be in China during that time. But it was a battle, right? It works for other people. It doesn't necessarily work for China. The second thing is sometimes, and this is a big part of it, and this goes back to some of the things that were said about the WTO. In the 1990s, China realized the number one thing that could prevent their rise was a negative response of the United States. And they had to delay that competitive response for as long as possible. If you emulate, that can directly threaten the equities of the great power. So just imagine this thought experiment. In 1995, if China had formed formal alliances with Russia and Iran, had started building military bases all over the world, do you think it would have taken us to 2017 to realize we were in a competition with them? Probably not. A lot of behavioral economics does experiments on this in which they show that we have a tendency to not see things that are different than what we do. And when we see them, we underestimate their effectiveness. We think, well, if that would have worked, I would have done that. That was the response to the Belt and Road Initiative, which was this major economic development project on the part of the PRC to build infrastructure around the world. The first responses to that was like, well, this is an idiotic thing, It's just going to cost them a lot of money and they're going to get nothing in return. So if you do exactly what the great power does, it might not work for you. You might have different competitive advantages. You might really spook the great power by threatening their own equities. And the last thing is there are areas where China looks at what the United States does and says, this doesn't even really work for them. I don't know why they're doing that, but even if the United States sits around and says they're doing a really good job in all these areas, we're taking a look and we're thinking, I think we're going to go a different way. So what I have articulated is there are some conditions under which emulation makes sense, which I'll lay out, but that China has a different approach, which I call the upstart approach. This is kind of like a startup that has to break their way into a market dominated by an already established strong company. Do you do exactly what that company does with fewer resources? Of course not. You have to find your own competitive advantages. So what China does is it pursues entrepreneurial actions, which is they try to pursue fundamentally different pathways to power than those that the United States does. And they try to leverage their own comparative advantages when they do it. And then they compete where the competitive forces are the weakest, the gaps in the system. But Paul was just mentioning about the WTO of it's not technically illegal, but so they can kind of get around it. All those loopholes, all those gaps. The United States, we love to complain that China, is violating all these norms and things like that. But we actually don't put the time in to assure that all those norms are really norms and established. There are things that the United States believes. There are things that sometimes the United States and its allies believe. But 80% of the world is now developing countries. A minority of countries are full-fledged democracies. So when we say that the world agrees with us, a lot of times the world does not agree with the U.S. position on things. They're agreeing with China's efforts to promote different norms. And so we actually have to put in the work. If we want to say, okay, we want this norm of freedom of navigation so the Chinese military stops harassing us when we're in international waters, it'd be really great if India was on board with that. It would be really great if Brazil was. And none of those countries continue to support China. It'd be really great if Taiwan stopped supporting China's claims in the South China Sea, right? If we can't even get Taiwan on board with our view of China's expansionism, then it's going to be really hard for the United States to promote some of those arguments. So they compete where those competitive forces are the weakest, where the United States just isn't present. A lot of times, China does not outcompete. We're just not there, right? I remember I did a month trip along in Central Asia, driving through Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. This was right after the Belt and Road. The Chinese are building roads there. And everyone there would have said, yeah, it'd be really great if the United States wanted to build a road. We haven't had a U.S. president visit that area in decades, right? In Africa, for example, Xi Jinping has visited 38 African countries. President Obama visited more African countries than any other previous U.S. president. He had visited 11. Meanwhile, I can't even count, how many times do our presidents have to go to the UK and Germany? All the time. We sort of focus on the same handful of countries and then we ignore the rest of the world. Well, guess who is not ignoring the rest of the world? China. So they have these blind spots, the gaps in the order, and they definitely exploit those. So this is where China has built a lot of its power. Now, it doesn't mean they do everything differently. Of course, China has embassies, right? They have a navy, so they're not reinventing the wheel in a lot of areas. And there's 3 areas in particular where emulation makes sense. This first bullet point is just basically like, if the United States is going to pay for everything, but you get all the benefits, sounds good. Okay, so there's a lot of cases of this, like international institutions where the United States has put forth a lot of effort into building these institutions, and China can get a lot of benefits without a lot of cost. The second is there's certain things that the United States and international order have deemed as legitimate or appropriate uses of power, so that when you do it, not only do you build power, but you get this extra prestige bump for it. So like China does a lot of its realistic like military training through participation in peacekeeping operations. Because when they contribute to peacekeeping operations, they get to be a responsible world power. They're the #1 contributor of the Permanent Five for this reason. They also tend to direct the peacekeeping operations to areas where they have economic interests in these countries, which is another interesting way of doing business. But everyone says like they're just so happy that China is contributing to the international order. So it makes sense. You get sort of a double bang for your buck. And the last one is there are a few areas that even though China is the second mover, they've determined that they can outcompete the United States because they have some sort of competitive advantage. So I teach a 2-day course to government officials on China's space and counter space programs, and this is one area. China spends about $8 billion on their civilian space program. We spend 48. And yet they have managed in recent years to do some extraordinary firsts, like landing on the far side of the moon. They're going to soon, in about 3 years, when we have decommissioned the International Space Station, they will be the only country the only entity with a space station that can sustain human life in space. And part of the reason they can do this at lower cost is their engineers are a lot cheaper than our engineers. So there are some areas where emulation makes sense with that respect. So in the time I have left, I just want to give you a few examples of what I'm talking about. And I try to use the most controversial examples, like the ones that people yell at me the most about. These are the ones that I sort of want to present to you. The first is if you've read in the news about we've discovered some silos and maybe China's building some more nuclear weapons, there's this fear that China is trying to compete for parity with the United States in nuclear strategy. But this is one area where China has always had a fundamentally different approach in every aspect, whether it's doctrine, force posture, types of weapons. They've always thought about nuclear weapons differently than the U.S. So the first thing is the United States has had various forms of aggression in terms of how we think about nuclear weapons. Some presidents are more forward-leaning on that than others, but we always reserve the right to basically use nuclear weapons whenever we want to, under whatever conditions. And even the Biden administration has said in the new nuclear posture review, they're not going to take this sole purpose approach, which is saying the sole purpose of nuclear weapons is to deter nuclear use. That's China's position, which means they have a note that they'll never use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear states, and they will never use them first. And their posture has always been one of minimum deterrence, with far fewer nuclear weapons than the United States. Even now that they have been ramping up, the upward estimates of how much they have today is 320, while the United States is 5,800. So it's really hard to argue that they're sort of fighting for parity. So they've increased their arsenal, but they're not striving to be exactly like the United States. And there's other indications of this. Most of their nuclear weapons are delivered by missile, 76%. The United States has been primarily air-based and sea-based for our delivery systems. China doesn't have tactical nuclear weapons because they don't believe nuclear weapons have a war-fighting purpose. 30% of the U.S. nuclear budget goes to developing and maintaining tactical nuclear weapons. And we have different structures. They have something called the Strategic Rocket Force, which is in charge of conventional and nuclear weapons, missiles, and we have Stratcom, right? So they also have an emulate in that support. Now, there's one area where there's some emulation that falls under this, and that's in arms control. Unsurprisingly, so there was all this research about China joining arms control regimes, and political scientists said it was because they'd been socialized into the way of thinking of the United States, that proliferation is bad. But in my research, if you look at the regimes that they have joined, given that they already had a different approach, they didn't want to go for parity, all these sorts of things, all of these regimes constrained the United States in a fundamental way that they weren't pursuing anyway, and therefore had very little cost for them. Same with conventional arms, which I'll get to in a second. The United States sells a lot of conventional arms. China doesn't. So signing on to a treaty that constrains what the United States can do and has very little impact on how you want to pursue power sounds pretty good. So there's this current debate we can get more into in the Q&A about where their arsenal is going, but even by the worst case scenario projections, which China currently doesn't have the infrastructure to even build that many nuclear weapons, but if we wanted to go with some of those projections, we're talking like a 2030 timeframe, they'd have about 1,000, again, to the US 5,800. Arms sales, another area that this is a key part of U.S. strategy for our political influence. And Chinese strategists recognize it's worked very well for the United States, but it's not going to work well for them. That they are not eager to compete directly with the United States because their stuff is not as good, and there is an opportunity cost for countries to make a switch, right? It's like if you use Apple everything, then buying an Android's kind of a headache. It's the same thing when it comes to making switches for arms suppliers. So what China has done is instead compete where competitive forces are the weakest. So first, let me just give you a sense of how limited. So this is China's arms trade volume compared to like the United States and other countries. So it's a very small percentage. There was one year when Trump offered more weapons to sell than China had sold in the previous decade. So this isn't to say that China doesn't do this, but it's not a key component of their strategy to build power in the international system. So who do they sell to? Two sort of gaps that they exploit where competitive forces are the weakest. It's countries that can't buy the United States because they're largely under embargo for human rights abuses. One. Two, certain types of technologies the United States cannot sell because we're under treaty obligations not to do so. In particular, unmanned aerial vehicles. So most of China's sales are to countries that cannot buy from the United States because they're human rights abusers or they're drones. The United States, most of what we sell is actually fighters, which is the biggest area of weakness for China. So again, China could not compete with us in that area. China also never uses arms embargoes as a tool of foreign policy. They've never initiated them unilaterally. They don't try to stop UN arms embargoes because they tend to go along with like UN multilateralism, but they never support US-led arms embargoes. They have sought to blunt some sales. So just because they don't emulate doesn't mean that they don't try to stop, in some cases, U.S. power from doing that. So I have two more examples I want to share with you. The next one I find particularly interesting. For the United States, besides selling weapons, training foreign militaries is a big part of what we do. Right? Joint exercises with other countries, professional military education with other countries. That's something we have to offer because we are always fighting wars. So we have a lot of experience to share. China looks at that and they're like, China hasn't fought a war since 1979. So, who's going to want to learn from the PLA on how to do this and learn from the PLA instead of the United States? Probably, not a lot of countries. But what China's really good at, and I don't mean to be facetious about this, but what they're really good at is internal repression. They actually spend more money on their budget to repress their own people than they do on their military. And they have the best practices at this, right? They have perfected the use of surveillance technology, firewalls for controlling information domestically, now like social credit systems, all this kind of stuff. And so what they have done is they don't train foreign militaries as much as the United States, but they have started training other countries' security forces, police, Coast Guard, militias. They have sold, kind of like how the United States will go in high-level visits and try to sell, our aircraft. Xi Jinping, when he goes and visits, he sells AI surveillance technology. He gives subsidies to Chinese companies and then gives those deals through those high-level summits. And actually the majority of countries that are buying that technology are democracies. For public security. So it's not just autocracies that are interested in this type of stuff, it's also democracy. So one of the big things that I'm doing in this book when we think about, what should our policies be, is Biden doing a good job, all of this is like, I don't even have a basic picture of what China is doing. Because of the assumptions of emulation, you can find data sets on all these things that are not important to China. Like I can tell you how many countries they did joint exercises with in any given year because people track that because it's important to the United States. But no one is tracking who they're training within these countries. And so part of this project is to go through, local Chinese newspapers to see, who the police academy and who they had, visit that week. So it's a bit of an undertaking to be able to present this kind of picture. And here's just one of the expansion of their surveillance technology, which is a big part of it. So the last thing I want to conclude on, I'll sort of food for thought, because this is one of the most controversial ones, is whether China is going to build military bases overseas. 15 years I've been in this debate. I've been like the sole voice at the Pentagon when they're like, oh, this is the year they're going to do it. And I'm like, how many years are we going to be like, they're doing it this year, right? When they said Belt and Road will be dangerous once they build military bases, China looks at the U.S. presence, 500,000 people overseas, 120 overseas bases, and they said, what has this bought the United States? The cost of foreign military intervention, 150 military interventions. Afghanistan cost 10 Belt and Road initiatives. Right? So China looks at this and they say, well, we don't want to do this. This doesn't make any sense. And so instead they have their own idea, and I'll skip through these just to tell you that China's got a lot of interests overseas. It's not that they don't. They have, at some points there's over 120 million Chinese people overseas. They have thousands of companies doing business. Their economy depends on it. So it's not that they don't care. It's just that they think a better way of doing it is a combination of training those host nation security forces, having private contractors, and then using peacekeeping to keep things in line. So for the sake of time, I'll just say these are just a few examples of how China does things differently. And the number one thing when people ask in the administration or otherwise for advice of like, how do we compete in this one area, is I would say we first have to figure out what China is actually doing and if they're even competing in that way. If there are gaps, we should fill them. I am not surprised that the international institutions we set up 70 years ago are not sufficient to deal with the problems we have today. But even the Biden administration, who wants to lead with diplomacy, is not interested in setting up new institutions. As a military planner, I would like ones to constrain and regulate cyber, outer space. Think more about, human rights and how we respond to human rights. Why do we pull people out of our embassies when we don't like a country versus doubling the amount of people that work at their embassies? There's so many areas we can talk about Q&A where when I go to cause trouble, the response I always get is, well, that's just how we do things. And the one thing I can tell you is we're not going to be competing with China by doing just more of the same stuff that we've always been doing. So with that, I'll conclude, and I look forward to our discussions.
Well, first of all, hearty thanks to our panelists for two very interesting presentations. And thanks to each of you for being here, either online or in person in our audience. It's great to see each of you. I'm going to keep my comments fairly brief because I want to make sure we have time for Q&A with the floor as well. I want to underscore two important points that I think are implied in Paul and Oriana's presentations, but are worth emphasizing and extending as we head into our broader discussion. So first, Paul's presentation engages with this crucial question of how we reflect on and how we evaluate decisions. And knowing what we know now, was admitting China to the World Trade Organization a mistake? Well, maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe instead, the crucial question is, knowing what we knew then, was China's admission to the WTO likely to be useful for the US? And this reframes the question to more accurately portray what the situation was. It was a gamble. And actively trying to keep China out of the WTO would have been a gamble. And trying to ignore China would have been a gamble. And the uncomfortable truth is that policy making is always a gamble. Because we are humans, and we don't know the future with certainty. So it's always going to be a gamble. Instead of judging this decision by whether we got an outcome that we like, let's think harder about whether the US government followed a decision-making process that made sense. And that really evaluates things in a different way. Did the US negotiators know all of the things that could have been known at that time? Did the US negotiators accurately estimate their counterparts' preferences or capabilities? And once we start asking questions like these, we can more easily spot some important connections between Paul's presentation and Oriana's presentation. Oriana argues that China is figuring things out as it goes along. And China, under current President Xi Jinping, looks quite different than China under his predecessors. That suggests that China's changes in direction were not all part of some long-running plan on the part of China. To make big foreign policy decisions more relatable, this reminds me of something that an older lady once told me in a humorous way about marriage. And she said to me, "Tana, here's the problem with marriage. The wives always count on the fact that the husbands will change. And meanwhile, the husbands always count on the fact that the wives won't change. And they both end up disappointed." So here I think we are looking at a situation where maybe the world can't be divided so simply into these two types of people. But we have a situation where the US was betting in an important way that by admitting China to the WTO, China was going to change, and it was going to change in some really specific ways. And rather than just asking whether that bet paid off, we also need to be considering whether the bet made sense, given the information and the situation back then. And maybe it did make sense. And the US just ended up with an outcome that was always possible. It was just unlikely, given the best information at that time. Let me now turn to Oriana's presentation, which engages with the crucial question of how much of a threat China poses to the US and whether the future will bring a new Cold War or a new hot war between the US and China. The security realm emphasized by Oriana is not completely separated from the economic realm that was emphasized by Paul. That was true during the old Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. And that was true economically, that the Soviet Union and the US during the Cold War were pitting capitalism versus socialism. And politically, it was pitting the US's democratic system versus the Soviet Union's communist one. But China isn't just the new Soviet Union. Yes, it's challenging the US militarily. But as Oriana points out, in doing that, it's not just emulating the capacity building that the Soviet Union pursued during the Cold War or the capacity building that the United States has been pursuing since then. It has taken some different paths too. And economically, China definitely isn't sticking to the Soviet Union's playbook. It's gotten rid of many parts of its previous socialist system, and besides that, its so-called state capitalism has some important similarities to strategies that were used successfully by countries such as Germany and Japan, in which governments try to tame markets to serve their own policy goals. But of course, for countries such as Japan, those policy goals didn't focus on military capabilities, because a country like Japan has been tucked under the US's security umbrella. So China isn't just the new Soviet Union, and it isn't just the new Japan either. It currently combines some of the communist political aspects of the Soviet Union with some of the capitalist economic aspects of Japan. And obviously, this leads to some tensions with the US. But maybe even more importantly, the bigger question is whether it leads to tensions or affinities with countries other than the US. Is modern-day Russia guaranteed to side with China against the US? Is modern-day Japan or Germany guaranteed to side with the US versus China? These are the kinds of questions that I'd like to see our presenters and all of us wrestle with as we contemplate not just the past, but also the future. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. I'm so honored to share this podium with our two speakers today. I've learned so much from your presentations today, but also your writings on these topics. So I will try to keep my comments very brief so that we have time for Q&A. And I just want to give a brief reaction to each of the presentations and raise some questions. So first, for Paul's presentation about the trade relationships and the WTO, my reaction is quite similar to Tana's in terms of drilling down into what it is that the US should have known at the time. So I think the gist of Paul's take is that America's approach to bringing China into the WTO system was reasonable and even tough and wise given the information that was available at the time, right? So you say that our UW alumna was not to blame for this, right? Implying that there were things that she couldn't have reasonably anticipated at the time. So a critic would say, a critic maybe coming from the international relations tradition would say that rising powers always renege on promises that they make when they're still weak, and that we knew that when we brought China into the WTO that we would be enriching China, or at least that we should have known that if we had read our history and our economics. And so there's really nothing surprising, and the U.S. should have foreseen this. So I want to push you a little bit. So, you imply that Barshevsky and the U.S. more broadly was wrong about some things, and that it did not correctly anticipate how China would eventually react. And I want to know, what do you think specifically we were wrong about, and was it really unknowable at the time? And I'm curious in particular whether you think the core dimension on which the U.S. was wrong was the gamble that China would liberalize more than it did, or is there something else that you think what we failed to anticipate? Building on that, I'm wondering if you could go back, how would you design, if you could whisper in your classmate's ear, if you could design the system to better anticipate the contingencies that you think should have been foreseeable, how would the system have looked different? What are some ways in which things could have been designed differently? And then finally, I'm curious about your thoughts about the broader U.S. strategy. So you had some specific thoughts about, for example, Trump's approach in 2018, where, instead of handling the conflicts inside the WTO system, he took a different approach. What's your broader view on what U.S. strategy should be when dealing with the rise in power that, for example, Oriana documents? So then turning briefly to Oriana's presentation, so I think this is a really fascinating, you give us fascinating insights into the limits of looking into history to make predictions about how China will innovate. And I also think that your emphasis on Chinese being the internal security partner of choice is incredibly important. So I'm going to channel, though, fundamentally you take a very pessimistic interpretation of what the future holds, in which China is a competitor that you're implying that it's perhaps even surpassing U.S. power. But there are lots of critics that take a different read of the data. So I'm going to channel someone like Michael Beckley and sort of see what you think. So the alternative view is that despite everything that Oriana showed us about China's progress, there are major limits to China's ability to keep growing at the rate that it has, and that China faces certain limitations, whereas the U.S. has some advantages. So on the U.S. advantage side, people have pointed to things like U.S. soft power and the sort of cultural power that the United States have. They've pointed to the U.S. alliance system, which China doesn't have anything comparable. They point to wealth in the U.S. They point to long-run growth prospects that have to do with things ranging from demographics, like a relatively young population, a highly educated population, point to natural resources, importantly, point to good political institutions that are able to make good decisions and harness resources efficiently. And then finally, economic advantages like the dollar being the global currency, right? So all of these are things that help U.S. long-run growth. And then finally, some geographic advantages, right? We have the luxury of being surrounded by relatively friendly states, isolated from other parts of the world, so we don't need to be constantly watching our backs in the same way that China does. So then on the China having disadvantages side, we've got a more aging, less healthy population, so less human capital, lower levels of education. We've got poor institutions, right? So the fact that China has to spend so much on internal security in order to maintain peace is a liability, right, that the U.S. doesn't face. We're also seeing this perhaps get even worse in terms of the increasing power in Xi Jinping's regime. Also, in terms of geographic challenges, lots of border disputes. China fundamentally is surrounded by at least competitors, and in some cases even unfriendly countries. It doesn't have the luxury of not having to keep an eye on all of its borders at the same time. So people that have taken a more optimistic view of China's rise point to all of these factors, and it's not to say that the U.S. shouldn't be concerned about China's growth, but that the prospects aren't quite as dire as some of the numbers that you show, and that perhaps China is reaching the apex of what it can expect. So I'm really curious to hear what you think about that perspective, and Obviously, you've thought about it deeply, I'm sure. So why is it that you're still as worried as you are? So I'll turn over the floor to our speakers. Thank you.
Great. Thank you to all of our panelists. So I think what we might do is I will open the floor to questions from the audience, and then as our speakers respond to those, if they also want to respond to our discussant comments sort of in turn, we'll proceed as such. So if anyone has questions, the floor is open. But yes. We have a microphone that we can bring to you.
Yeah, I was going to ask Oriana, I think you're correct about the question of China playing a role in assisting the public security agencies in various countries. Would you say that China is playing a role that East Germany used to fulfill? They were notorious for supplying assistance, technical and human, to countries like Libya and Ethiopia during the Cold War, as well as technical support to a lot of the Soviet bloc countries. I also had a second question going back to the Cold War with regard to China's behavior, particularly during the Sino-Soviet rift. At that time, China engaged in a pattern sometimes of trying to woo certain of the communist countries. Examples would be Albania or Cuba, where they tried to woo those countries into the Chinese orbit. In the case of Albania, they were quite successful for many years. In the case of Cuba, where they also were trying to do that, they were much less successful because I think the Soviets clamped down on Cuba and told Cuba to start towing the Moscow line if they wanted to continue to receive subsidies from the Soviet Union. So be interested in your observations on those two questions. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you for those questions, and it's good I can answer those and also piggyback off of some of the questions that Jessica had. So I think, and I am not an expert on Soviet history or on East Germany. I mean, I actually, when I was at the Pentagon, it comes up a lot that people are like, well, we're so used to dealing with the Soviet Union that maybe that's why we think this, that. And I'm always like, well, I'm not used to it, because I'm 30 years younger than the rest of you. So I will tell you that I'm not an authority on that, but my sense is one of the big differences is that this isn't China helping autocracies repress their populations. As I mentioned, majority of their customers are actually democracies. So they are trying, and then they have this idea of cyber norms that are a bit different, in which they're trying to convince countries that they have more control over what happens with the internet within their borders. That goes contrary to how the United States wants to do things, but it doesn't cleanly fall on domestic political lines the same way. And I think this is also why it takes us a while to consider this, a challenge or a threat. If the Italians are happy with Chinese police patrolling their streets, if the Spanish are signing treaties allowing extradition, and if Interpol is going to put in charge a Chinese person who focuses on capturing Chinese dissidents, it blurs a lot of those lines, I think, in a way that makes it hard for us to understand what's going on. And in a section of my book, I do talk about the United States has a promotion of democracy as a key tool of our foreign policy. China, their alternative is not promoting autocracy. I think there's a reason why there's no word autocratization in English, the way there is democratization. It's a model of regime neutrality. And a large part of this is early on, China realized that to be powerful, the most important relationships they were going to have was with the United States and U.S. allies and partners. 60% of their trade are with those countries. So they didn't want an organizational principle that alienated themselves from those countries. So like Jessica asked me about the U.S. alliance system, is this a strength? Is it a weakness? I think that's debatable. I mean, the Chinese have a different approach, and so I have a chapter on the book about why they don't pursue alliances, because again, they would be the first to admit the U.S. got all the good allies, So, I mean, what are you going to do? Be allies with Russia and Iran, and then How much does that help your military power? Not that much. Like, how much headache does that give you? A lot. And that they really want good relations with Europe. So the alliance construct wasn't going to work for them. So they pursued a different construct called strategic partnerships, in which they tried to elevate the economic considerations over security considerations in their agreements with a lot of other countries. But along those lines, one of the things, because me and Michael Beckley and my other colleague Hal Brands were actually all at the American Enterprise Institute, so we're constantly just like writing things in contradiction to each other. But this is one of the main reasons I'm writing this book, is because I'm very concerned that the first step to competing is actually understanding what's going on. And I feel like people like Michael Beckley and Hal Brands, they're like a taxi company looking at Uber and saying, but we own more cars. Michael Beckley in his own writing talked extensively about how many military bases the United States has overseas. Or when he talks about the military, he talked about how China, the military is downsizing. But the military is downsizing to become more professional so they can become more lethal. Just because they have less people doesn't make them less powerful. And even having more old people in the system, they have a different social construct in which the children are required by law to take care of their parents. It doesn't have the same impact on the society. So there are a lot of economic problems with China, but I'll just sort of tell you an anecdote that makes me worry, not to say that I'm right or Michael's right, but makes me worry about the metrics we're using. After Trump was elected, I was living in Washington, D.C., and there was a march of women. And I participated, a lot of us participated. I think it was like over 1 million people took to the streets. I still talk to a Chinese tutor in Beijing every week to keep up my Chinese. And the following Monday, we had a call, and she was like, "Are you okay?" I was like, "Well, what do you mean?" She was like, 1 million people were on the streets surrounding the White House. Like, is your government going to collapse? And it was like, well, I can see from the Chinese perspective that seems like a very dangerous thing. But like in the United States, it's not that much of a problem. So my big concern about these weaknesses, it's like you could do the same thing. You could be like, well, how many people are shot on the streets of the United States? Does that mean we're declining power? So we go back and forth on these metrics. And I guess what I'm trying to say is we have to be a bit more careful in terms of what we evaluate as strengths and weaknesses. And the one area, there's many areas of failure I also note in my book that I didn't note here, but one of them is soft power, where China should not have tried to compete directly with the United States, but in 2007 did put forth a policy of saying we are going to be more attractive than our movies are going to be better, and our design, and their movies are horrible. I still don't understand how they can reverse engineer the most advanced military equipment, but they can't seem to put together a movie that I can sit down and watch. So I think there are a lot of areas of weakness. I guess my big question are like, which ones do you say, yeah, I'm not great at that, but is that fundamental to what makes me powerful or not?
So we should not be concerned about the Chinese rom-com industry taking over. I want give Paul a chance to respond to some of the comments, but I'm going to tag on a question myself, chair's prerogative. I don't know if Catherine's here from the first panel. Catherine Rampell and I were discussing last night. We were kind of having this debate over phase one, right, which you mentioned, right, which was the Trump deal to tell China you need to buy more things, and we're going to roll down our tariffs in response to you buying all these things. And even before the ink was dry on this, right, everyone knew this was a non-starter, right? China had never purchased this many goods from the United States. And of course, China claims it's COVID and global disruption, but this was most economists that I'm aware of thought this was a non-starter from the beginning. So then, our discussion was, here's an easy political point to make, right? You say, Biden should come out and de-Trump his trade policy and say, hey, Mr. Dealmaker made this deal and it was terrible, right? And China didn't keep it. And we're under inflationary pressure. Let's lower tariffs. Let's get out of this and restore this. But as you say, it has continued as Trump light. So my curiosity from your perspective is what really is kind of driving this continuation of these policies?
Okay, thanks. So I really thought I'll sort of do it chronologically, starting with the entry into the WTO, right? So you're asking very, very good questions about, and both of you are, I think, the heart of it. It's like, well, policy is always compared to what, and but you, Jessica, you sort of went beyond that and say, well, wait a minute, but shouldn't you have known? And was it a gamble? Yes. I mean, Warshevsky herself has used that term when she's confronted with, how could you have possibly let this happen? Yes, it was a gamble. It was a gamble at its fundamental level. It was a gamble that if we didn't do it, China would definitely be our enemy. And if we did do it, there was a chance that China wouldn't be our enemy. Looking at it. There are two other major insights I'd like to try to offer into this. So first of all, and this is one that Warshevsky herself and others have often made, which is that the terms of China's entry into the WTO actually gave the U.S. a lot of powers against Chinese imports that it didn't use. I mentioned those WTO plus and minus provisions. The Chinese agreed to allow the U.S. to raise tariffs against surges of Chinese imports much more easily than it could against any other country. And the Bush administration never used it. I think they considered it, but they decided not to use that. And that could have been, we'll never know how effective it would have been if they had. But in any case, they didn't avail themselves of it. I don't think that's I would say the better way of looking at this is, okay, so should the U.S. have said to the Chinese, we just don't think you're the kind of country that will abide by rules. We think you're sorry, you just don't make the grade. You won't ever be a responsible stakeholder, to use the term that Bob Zellick used. And sorry, nice try. I think that would have guaranteed years of incredible conflict with the U.S. trying to use unilateral power against China. China would have been an export juggernaut in any case. It might have been less of an export juggernaut. It might have gotten rich more slowly, but it would have been an export juggernaut. I mean, this is not all because we let their products into our country. Those people work really hard, and they invest in their infrastructure, they invest in their ports, and they're very good at manufacturing. And every time the U.S. tried to use unilateral sanctions against it, we always backed off at the last minute anyway, because the fact is that we didn't want to enter into a trade war with. The Chinese were not. They were a lot less powerful than they are today. As I love the way you put it, Oriana. But they were. But the idea of just going to economic war with them was just not on. And Congress every year passed most favored nation status for the Chinese because they really didn't see that the alternative was viable. So. Could we have, would it have made sense to just say, we're not going to let you in this institute? We don't think that the rules-based system will work with you. I would argue that the rules-based system, although it has worked very imperfectly, to put it mildly, with China, that it was still a lot better than the alternative. It has constrained them in a number of areas. As I said, when they lost cases, they complied with the rulings. They've been very good about that. Better than, as I said, better than the United States. And I may be hopelessly naive in saying this, but I still think that the Hillman proposal for bringing a big case against China in the WTO would have been the best way to confront them, because again, they're unilateral bullying just doesn't get you anywhere. Fundamental with China, but approaching them in a multilateral forum where you're saying, look, this is the international community here, all say, right? That's a different story. So, I'm being told I'm droning on too long, which is absolutely accurate. But anyway, no, very good questions, and I think you're quite, yeah. I was aware that I was not addressing that point, and I'm glad you raised it.
Great. So yes, we are unfortunately at our witching hour, so 2:45. So please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists for great presentations.